Nello and Patrasche were alone in the world. They were best friends, even closer than brothers. Nello was a small boy from Ardennes, and Patrasche was a big dog from Flanders. They were the same age, but Nello was young, and Patrasche was old. They had always lived together. Both were orphans and had no family. They had been saved by the same kind person. From that moment, they stayed together, and their friendship became stronger every day. They lived in a small hut on the edge of a tiny village in Flanders, not far from Antwerp. The village had about 20 houses, all painted in bright colors. In the center of the village, there was an old windmill on a small hill. People used it to grind wheat. Nearby, there was a little gray church with a bell that rang every morning, noon, and night. Nello and Patrasche lived with an old man named Johann Das. He was very poor and very old. Many years ago, he had been a soldier, but now he could not walk well because of an old wound. When Johann was 80 years old, his daughter died and left him her little son, Nello, who was only 2 years old. Johann was already weak, but he took care of Nello with love. Their house was small and simple, made of mud. It was always clean, and they had a little garden where they grew vegetables. They were very poor. Many days they had almost nothing to eat. But Johann was kind, and Nello was a good boy. They were happy, even with only a little bread and cabbage. They were happiest when Patrasche was with them. Patrasche was very important to them. He was their helper, their friend, and their protector. Without him, they could not live. Johann was too old, and Nello was just a child. Patrasche was their strong and loyal dog. Patrasche was a big, strong dog with yellow fur and big ears. He came from a family of working dogs. His ancestors had pulled heavy carts in Flanders for many years. His life had been hard. When he was still a young puppy, he was sold to a man who treated him very badly. Patrasche had to pull a heavy cart full of metal pots and pans all day while his owner sat and drank beer. His owner never let him rest and often hit him. One hot summer day, Patrasche was too tired, hungry, and thirsty. He could not walk anymore and collapsed on the road. His cruel owner was angry, kicked him, and left him there to die. Many people passed by, but no one stopped to help. Then an old man, Johann Das, saw the dog and felt sorry for him. He took Patrasche home, where Nello helped care for him. They gave him food, water, and a place to rest. Slowly, Patrasche became strong again. For the first time, Patrasche felt love and kindness. He had a warm place to sleep and people who cared about him. Patrasche was very grateful. When he was well again, he wanted to help Johann with his work. Johann was too old to carry the milk cans to the town of Antwerp, so Patrasche started to pull the cart. Johann did not want to make Patrasche work, but Patrasche insisted. In the end, Johann let him help. In winter, life was very hard. The hut was cold, and there was often not enough food. But they had each other, and they were happy. They spent their days working and resting together. Patrasche was happy to help Johann, and Nello was happy to be with his best friend. One day, Johann became too weak to pull the cart. Nello, who was now a little older, started to do the work with Patrasche. They became a team, and the villagers loved seeing them together. Nello was a beautiful boy with bright eyes, and many people admired him and his dog. Over the years, Nello, Patrasche, and Johann lived a simple but happy life. They worked, played, and rested together, and their love for each other never changed. Even though life was sometimes difficult, they were always together, and that made them happy. For many weeks, Patrasche was weak and sick. He could not move and was close to death. But during this time, no one hurt him. He only heard the kind voice of the child and felt the gentle touch of the old man. As Patrasche lay sick, both the old man and the little boy grew to love him. He had a corner of the small hut where he slept on a bed of dry grass. Every night, they listened carefully to his breathing, hoping he was still alive. One day, Patrasche tried to bark, but it was weak and broken. When Nello and Jehan heard this, they laughed with joy and almost cried because they knew he was getting better. Nello was so happy that he made a flower chain and placed it around Patrasche's neck, kissing him with his soft, warm lips. When Patrasche finally stood up again, he was strong and big, but his eyes looked surprised. No one shouted at him, no one hit him. His heart was filled with love, and from that moment, he was completely loyal to them. Patrasche was a dog, but he was also very grateful. He watched his new family with big, thoughtful eyes. Jehan Das was an old soldier, and he could not work much. Every day he took a small cart and carried milk to Antwerp for the villagers. They gave him this job because he was honest and kind, but it was hard for him because he was 83 years old, and Antwerp was far away. One day, Patrasche watched the milk cans going in and out of the cart as he lay in the sun with his flower chain around his neck. The next morning, before Jehan could touch the cart, Patrasche stood in front of it and placed himself between the handles. He wanted to help. Jehan did not want to make him work, but Patrasche refused to move. He even tried to pull the cart with his teeth. In the end, Jehan let him do it. He changed the cart so that Patrasche could pull it more easily. From that day, Patrasche worked every morning. When winter came, Jehan was very thankful that he had found Patrasche. He was getting older and weaker, and without Patrasche, he would not have been able to carry the heavy milk cans in the snow. But for Patrasche, this work was easy. After the painful work he had done before, this felt light and fun. His new master never hit him or shouted at him. Instead, he spoke kindly and patted him gently. His work finished by the afternoon, and then he could do whatever he liked: stretch out, sleep in the sun, run in the fields, play with Nello, or be with other dogs. Patrasche was finally happy. Luckily, his cruel old master never came back. He had died in a fight at a festival. Patrasche could live in peace. A few years passed and Jehan became very weak. His legs stopped working well, and he could not take the cart to town anymore. Nello was now 6 years old, and he knew the way to Antwerp because he had gone many times with his grandfather. So, he took Jehan's place, walking beside Patrasche, selling milk, taking money, and giving it back to the villagers. Nello was a beautiful child with kind, dark eyes, soft golden hair, and rosy cheeks. Many artists liked to draw him and Patrasche as they walked through the town. The little cart, the shiny milk cans, the big golden dog with his harness, and the small boy in wooden shoes looked like a painting. Nello and Patrasche worked together happily. When Jehan started feeling a little better in the summer, he did not need to leave the house. He would sit outside and watch them go through the garden gate. Then he would rest, pray, and wake up again in the afternoon to wait for their return. When they came home, Patrasche would shake off his harness with joy, and Nello would proudly tell his grandfather about their day. Then they would eat together, watch the sun set over the fields, and listen to the church bell ring. At night, they would sleep peacefully while Jehan said his prayers. The years passed, and their lives were simple and happy. Spring and summer were their favorite times. Flanders was not a very beautiful land, but it was full of green fields. In the distance, church towers stood tall and bells rang softly. The land stretched endlessly, looking the same everywhere. But for Nello and Patrasche, it was enough. After work, they would lie in the grass beside the canal, watching the boats go by, smelling the fresh country air mixed with the salty scent of the sea. Winter was harder. They had to wake up early in the dark and cold. They never had enough food, and their little hut was not warm. In summer, the hut was covered with green vines and looked beautiful. But in winter, the wind blew through its broken walls. Sometimes water flooded the floor and then froze. The cold was painful for Nello's small body, and the ice cut Patrasche's feet. But no matter how hard things were, they had each other. And that was enough. Even in the cold winter, Nello and Patrasche never complained. The little boy in his wooden shoes and the big dog with his 4 strong legs walked bravely together across the frozen fields. The bells on Patrasche's harness jingled as they moved. Sometimes, kind people in Antwerp would help them. A housewife might give them a bowl of soup and some bread. A friendly trader might throw some firewood into their cart for them to take home. A kind villager might let them keep a little milk for themselves. On these days, they ran home happily, laughing and shouting with joy. So even though life was hard, they were happy. Patrasche saw many other dogs working from morning to night. These dogs were often beaten and left hungry in the cold after their work. When he saw them, he felt lucky. His life was difficult, too. He was sometimes hungry. He had to work in the hot sun and the cold wind, and his paws hurt from the rough streets. But he did his work happily because he was loved. That was enough for him. There was only one thing that made Patrasche sad. Antwerp was full of big, old buildings, tall, dark, and grand. Bells rang from them, and music came from inside. These great churches stood in the middle of the busy, noisy city, surrounded by markets and crowds. Inside one of these churches, in a quiet place, was the grave of a great artist, Rubens. His paintings made Antwerp famous, and the city was proud of him. Without Rubens, Antwerp would just be another busy market town. But because of him, people from all over the world came to see his work. Patrasche did not understand all this, but he knew that Nello loved those churches. Many times, Nello would go inside, and Patrasche had to wait outside, lying on the cold stones. He did not understand why Nello went in so often, or why he always looked different when he came out, sometimes pale, sometimes excited, but always quiet and deep in thought. Patrasche did not like to see his friend so serious. He tried to keep Nello happy by playing with him in the fields or the market. But Nello kept going back to the church, especially to the big cathedral. Patrasche would lie outside, sighing and waiting until Nello finally came out. Then, Nello would hug Patrasche, kiss his forehead, and whisper the same words. "If only I could see them, Patrasche. If only I could see them." Patrasche did not know what they were. One day when no one was watching, Patrasche followed Nello inside. He finally saw what Nello wanted so much to see: 2 big paintings covered with cloth, hanging beside the altar. Nello was kneeling, staring at the painting of the Assumption. When he noticed Patrasche, he gently led him outside. His face was wet with tears. As they left, he looked back at the covered paintings and said sadly, "It's so unfair, Patrasche. We cannot see them because we are poor. When Rubens painted them, I am sure he wanted everyone to see them. He would have wanted us to look at them every day, but they keep them covered in the dark. No one sees them unless they have money to pay. If I could see them just once, I would be happy, even if I died." But Nello could not see them, and Patrasche could not help him. To see the paintings, they needed a silver coin, but they were too poor. They never had any extra money. If they earned enough for a little firewood and food, they were lucky. Still, Nello dreamed of the paintings every day. He thought about them when he walked through Antwerp in the early mornings before the sun rose. He was just a poor boy selling milk, but in his heart, he was living in a world of beauty. He dreamed of Rubens, the great artist. Even when he was cold and hungry, wearing thin clothes and wooden shoes, his mind was full of art. Nello was not like the other village children. He had a special gift. He could see beauty everywhere. No one knew this, not even himself. Only Patrasche knew. He watched Nello draw pictures in the dirt with chalk. He heard him whisper prayers to the spirit of Rubens. He saw his eyes light up at the colors of the sunset or the morning sky. Sometimes, when Nello hugged him tightly, Patrasche felt warm tears fall on his fur. Jahan Das, the old man, did not understand. From his bed, he would say, "I will be happy if, when you grow up, you can own this hut and the little garden. You can work for yourself and be called boss by the neighbors. For a Flemish farmer, owning land and being called boss, master, was the greatest success. Jahan had traveled the world as a soldier, but believed that staying in one place, working honestly and living simply was the best life. But Nello said nothing. He dreamed of something else. He did not want to be a farmer. He did not want to own the small hut. When he saw the tall cathedral in the evening sky or in the misty morning, he thought of something bigger. But he spoke of these dreams only to Patrasche. He whispered them to his dog as they worked in the cold mornings or rested by the water in the afternoons. He could not tell anyone else. They would not understand. The old man would not believe that a poor boy could dream of painting like Rubens. To Jahan, the pictures on the walls of the village tavern were just as good as the famous paintings in the churches. There was only one person, besides Patrasche, who listened to Nello's dreams. That was Alois. Alois was the daughter of Bas Koges, the miller. She lived in the biggest house in the village. She had no brothers or sisters, and she always had warm clothes and good food. On special days, she wore beautiful lace that had belonged to her mother and grandmother. People in the village said she would be a fine wife for a rich man one day, but she was just a happy little girl who loved playing with Nello and Patrasche. Alois, Nello, and Patrasche spent their days together. They played in the fields, ran in the snow, picked flowers, and sat by the warm fire at the mill. One day, Bas Koges, the miller, found them in the field behind the mill. The grass had been cut that day, and Alois was sitting in the hay with Patrasche's big golden head resting on her lap. Nello was drawing their picture on a smooth piece of wood with a stick of charcoal. The miller looked at the drawing with tears in his eyes. It looked so real, and he loved his only child very much. But then, he scolded Alois for sitting outside when her mother needed help inside the house. She ran indoors, crying. Then, he turned to Nello and took the wooden panel from his hands. "Do you draw a lot?" he asked, but his voice was not as firm as before. Nello blushed and lowered his head. "I draw everything I see," he said softly. The miller was silent for a moment. Then, he reached into his pocket and held out a silver coin. "It is a waste of time," he said, "but it looks just like Alois, and my wife will like it. Take this coin and leave the picture with me." Nello's face lost its color. He lifted his head, put his hands behind his back, and said, "Keep both the money and the picture, Bas Koges. You have always been kind to me." Then he called Patrasche and walked away across the field. "I could have seen the paintings with that Frank," he whispered to Patrasche, "but I could not sell her picture, not even for them." That night, Bas Koges sat in his mill house, feeling troubled. "That boy should not be so close to Alois," he told his wife. "He is 15 and she is 12. The boy is good-looking." "But he is also kind and honest," his wife said, as she admired the picture, which now hung over the fireplace next to the cuckoo clock and a wax cross. "Yes, I know," said the miller, drinking from his pewter mug. "Then, if they were to marry one day, would it be so bad?" his wife asked hesitantly. "Alois has enough money for both of them, and happiness is the most important thing. You are a woman and do not understand," the miller said harshly, tapping his pipe on the table. "That boy is just a beggar, worse than a beggar, with his foolish ideas about painting. Keep them apart, or I will send Alois to the nuns of the Sacred Heart." His wife was frightened and promised to do as he wished. She did not want to be too cruel to Nello, who had done nothing wrong. But she found ways to keep Alois away from him. Nello, who was quiet and sensitive, noticed it immediately. He stopped going to the mill. He did not know what he had done wrong, but he thought Bas Koges was angry about the drawing of Alois. When Alois ran to him and held his hand, he smiled at her sadly. "No, Alois," he said gently. "Do not make your father angry. He thinks I make you waste time. He loves you and wants the best for you. We should not upset him." But it made Nello sad. The world no longer looked as bright as before. The red mill had always been a special place for him. He used to stop there every day to greet the family. Alois would come running with a smile, offering a piece of bread to Patrasche. Now the door stayed closed. Patrasche looked at it longingly, and Nello walked past without stopping, feeling a sharp pain in his heart. Alois sat inside, crying quietly as she knitted by the stove. Boss Koges, working with the sacks of flour, tried to ignore his feelings. "It is better this way," he told himself. "The boy is poor and only dreams foolish dreams. Who knows what trouble might come in the future?" So, he kept the door shut, allowing Nello to visit only on rare occasions. But these visits felt cold and formal. The two children, who had always been happy together, now felt like strangers. Patrasche, sensing their sadness, wagged his tail and rang the bells on his harness, trying to cheer them up. But nothing was the same. Through all of this, the little drawing remained above the fireplace in the mill house. Sometimes, Nello felt it was unfair that his gift was welcomed, but he was not. Yet he did not complain. He had learned from his grandfather, Jehan Das, that poor people must accept life as it is. "We are poor, Nello," the old man always said. "We must take what God gives us, the bad and the good. Poor people cannot choose." Nello listened respectfully, but in his heart, he still believed in hope. Sometimes the poor do choose, he thought. They choose to be great so that no one can turn them away. One day Alois found Nello alone in the cornfields by the canal. She ran to him crying, "Tomorrow is my saint's day," she sobbed. "For the first time in my life, my parents did not invite you to my party." Nello kissed her hand and whispered, "One day, Alois, things will be different. One day, your father will not turn me away. That small picture I gave him will be worth more than silver. Only love me always, Alois, and I will become great." "And if I don't love you?" she asked, pouting through her tears. Nello's eyes looked past her, toward the distant cathedral spire, glowing in the red and gold evening sky. His face was both sad and full of hope. "I will still be great," he said quietly, "or I will die." Alois, only a child, did not understand his words. "You don't love me," she said, pushing him away. But Nello only smiled and walked through the golden cornfields, lost in his dreams. He imagined a future where he would return as a famous artist. The villagers would gather, whispering, "Look, he is great now. The whole world knows his name. And yet, he was once just our poor Nello, the boy who only had his dog." He dreamed of wrapping his grandfather in fine clothes and painting his portrait, just like the great artists painted noble men. He imagined placing a golden collar around Patrasche's neck and saying, "This dog was once my only friend." He even dreamed of building a great marble house, looking toward the cathedral spire. He would not live there alone. He would open its doors to poor, talented boys like him, so they could follow their dreams. "If people thank me," he thought, "I will tell them, 'Do not thank me, thank Rubens. Without him, I would be nothing.'" These dreams filled his heart so much that even though he was sad, he felt happy. That evening, he and Patrasche sat outside their little hut, listening to the music and laughter coming from the mill. All the village children were there, celebrating Alois's Saint's Day with cakes and dancing. But Nello and Patrasche were alone, eating only black bread. "Never mind, Patrasche," Nello said, hugging his dog. "One day, things will change." Nello believed in the future, but Patrasche, who had seen more of the world, only growled when they passed the mill. He did not believe in dreams as easily as his young master. That night, Jehan Das, lying weak in bed, asked, "Today is Alois's name day, isn't it?" Nello nodded. He wished his grandfather had forgotten. "And why are you not there?" the old man asked. "You have never missed it before." "You are sick," Nello said gently. "I could not leave you alone." "That is not the reason," Jahan said, looking into his grandson's eyes. Nello hesitated. "Vasconguez did not invite me this year. I think he is angry because I drew a picture of Alois." The old man was silent. He understood the truth. He pulled Nello close and whispered, "You are very poor, my child. It is hard for you." "But I am rich," Nello murmured. He truly believed it, rich with dreams and hope. That night, he stood outside, looking at the stars. The mill was full of light and laughter. A few tears fell from his eyes, but he smiled. "The future," he whispered to himself. Then he and Patrasche went inside and fell into a deep sleep. Nello had a secret, one that only Patrasche knew. Behind their hut was a small room that no one else entered. There, in the bright northern light, Nello had built a simple easel from rough wood. On a large sheet of gray paper, he had drawn a picture, his best work yet. It was a picture of an old man sitting on a fallen tree at sunset. He had seen the woodcutter, Michel, sitting like that many times. No one had taught him how to draw, but somehow he had captured the sadness and patience of the old man's face. It was not perfect, but it was real. Patrasche had watched him work for months, knowing that Nello had a great dream. In Antwerp, there was a competition for young artists. The winner would receive 200 francs a year to study art. If Nello won, it would be his first step toward the future he dreamed of. The miller looked at the drawing with tears in his eyes. It looked so real, and he loved his only child very much. But then, he scolded Alois for sitting outside when her mother needed help inside the house. She ran indoors, crying. Then, he turned to Nello and took the wooden panel from his hands. "Do you draw a lot?" he asked, but his voice was not as firm as before. Nello blushed and lowered his head. "I draw everything I see," he said softly. The miller was silent for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and held out a silver coin. "It is a waste of time," he said. "But it looks just like Alois, and my wife will like it. Take this coin and leave the picture with me." Nello's face lost its color. He lifted his head, put his hands behind his back, and said, "Keep both the money and the picture, Vasconguez. You have always been kind to me." Then he called Patrasche and walked away across the field. "I could have seen the paintings with that franc," he whispered to Patrasche. "But I could not sell her picture, not even for them." That night, Vasconguez sat in his mill house, feeling troubled. "That boy should not be so close to Alois," he told his wife. "He is 15 and she is 12. The boy is good-looking. But he is also kind and honest," his wife said as she admired the picture, which now hung over the fireplace next to the cuckoo clock and a wax cross. "Yes, I know," said the miller, drinking from his pewter mug. "Then, if they were to marry one day, would it be so bad?" his wife asked hesitantly. "Alois has enough money for both of them, and happiness is the most important thing." "You are a woman and do not understand," the miller said harshly, tapping his pipe on the table. "That boy is just a beggar, worse than a beggar, with his foolish ideas about painting. Keep them apart, or I will send Alois to the nuns of the Sacred Heart." His wife was frightened and promised to do as he wished. She did not want to be too cruel to Nello, who had done nothing wrong. But she found ways to keep Alois away from him. Nello, who was quiet and sensitive, noticed it immediately. He stopped going to the mill. He did not know what he had done wrong, but he thought Vasconguez was angry about the drawing of Alois. When Alois ran to him and held his hand, he smiled at her sadly. "No, Alois," he said gently. "Do not make your father angry. He thinks I make you waste time. He loves you and wants the best for you. We should not upset him." But it made Nello sad. The world no longer looked as bright as before. The Red Mill had always been a special place for him. He used to stop there every day to greet the family. Alois would come running with a smile, offering a piece of bread to Patrasche. Now, the door stayed closed. Patrasche looked at it longingly, and Nello walked past without stopping, feeling a sharp pain in his heart. Alois sat inside, crying quietly as she knitted by the stove. Bas Koges, working with the sacks of flour, tried to ignore his feelings. "It is better this way," he told himself. "The boy is poor and only dreams foolish dreams. Who knows what trouble might come in the future?" So he kept the door shut, allowing Nello to visit only on rare occasions. But these visits felt cold and formal. The two children, who had always been happy together, now felt like strangers. Patrasche, sensing their sadness, wagged his tail and rang the bells on his harness, trying to cheer them up. But nothing was the same. Through all of this, the little drawing remained above the fireplace in the mill house. Sometimes Nello felt it was unfair that his gift was welcomed, but he was not. Yet he did not complain. He had learned from his grandfather, Jehan Das, that poor people must accept life as it is. "We are poor, Nello," the old man always said. "We must take what God gives us, the bad and the good. Poor people cannot choose." Nello listened respectfully, but in his heart, he still believed in hope. "Sometimes the poor do choose," he thought. "They choose to be great, so that no one can turn them away." One day, Alois found Nello alone in the cornfields by the canal. She ran to him, crying. "Tomorrow is my saint's day," she sobbed. "For the first time in my life, my parents did not invite you to my party." Nello kissed her hand and whispered, "One day, Alois, things will be different. One day, your father will not turn me away. That small picture I gave him will be worth more than silver. Only love me always, Alois, and I will become great." "And if I don't love you?" she asked, pouting through her tears. Nello's eyes looked past her, toward the distant cathedral spire, glowing in the red and gold evening sky. His face was both sad and full of hope. "I will still be great," he said quietly, "or I will die." Alois, only a child, did not understand his words. "You don't love me," she said, pushing him away. But Nello only smiled and walked through the golden cornfields, lost in his dreams. He imagined a future where he would return as a famous artist. The villagers would gather, whispering, "Look, he is great now. The whole world knows his name. And yet, he was once just our poor Nello, the boy who only had his dog." He dreamed of wrapping his grandfather in fine clothes and painting his portrait, just like the great artists painted noblemen. He imagined placing a golden collar around Patrasche's neck and saying, "This dog was once my only friend." He even dreamed of building a great marble house, looking toward the cathedral spire. He would not live there alone. He would open its doors to poor, talented boys like him, so they could follow their dreams. "If people thank me," he thought, "I will tell them, 'Do not thank me. Thank Rubens. Without him, I would be nothing.'" These dreams filled his heart so much that even though he was sad, he felt happy. That evening, he and Patrasche sat outside their little hut, listening to the music and laughter coming from the mill. All the village children were there, celebrating Alois's Saint's Day with cakes and dancing. But Nello and Patrasche were alone, eating only black bread. "Never mind, Patrasche," Nello said, hugging his dog. "One day, things will change." Nello believed in the future, but Patrasche, who had seen more of the world, only growled when they passed the mill. He did not believe in dreams as easily as his young master. That night, Jehan Das, lying weak in bed, asked, "Today is Alois's name day, isn't it?" Nello nodded. He wished his grandfather had forgotten. "And why are you not there?" the old man asked. "You have never missed it before." "You are sick," Nello said gently. "I could not leave you alone." "That is not the reason," Jahan said, looking into his grandson's eyes. Nello hesitated. "Boss Coguez did not invite me this year. I think he is angry because I drew a picture of Alois." The old man was silent. He understood the truth. He pulled Nello close and whispered, "You are very poor, my child. It is hard for you." "But I am rich," Nello murmured. He truly believed it, rich with dreams and hope. That night, he stood outside, looking at the stars. The mill was full of light and laughter. A few tears fell from his eyes, but he smiled. "The future," he whispered to himself. Then, he and Patrasche went inside and fell into a deep sleep. Nello had a secret, one that only Patrasche knew. Behind their hut was a small room that no one else entered. There, in the bright northern light, Nello had built a simple easel from rough wood. On a large sheet of gray paper, he had drawn a picture, his best work yet. It was a picture of an old man sitting on a fallen tree at sunset. He had seen the woodcutter, Michel, sitting like that many times. No one had taught him how to draw, but somehow he had captured the sadness and patience of the old man's face. It was not perfect, but it was real. Patrasche had watched him work for months, knowing that Nello had a great dream. In Antwerp, there was a competition for young artists. The winner would receive 200 francs a year to study art. If Nello won, it would be his first step toward the future he dreamed of. Nello told no one about his drawing. His grandfather would not understand, and Alois was no longer allowed to see him. Only Patrasche knew his secret. "Rubens would give me the prize if he knew," Nello whispered to his dog. Patrasche believed it too. He knew that Rubens had loved dogs. He had painted them with such care and kindness. And Patrasche knew that people who loved dogs were always kind. The drawings had to be sent by December 1st, and the winner would be announced on December 24th. That way, the boy who won could celebrate with his family at Christmas. On a cold winter evening, with his heart full of hope and fear, Nello placed his drawing on the little green milk cart. With Patrasche's help, he took it to town and left it at the doors of the big public building. "Maybe my drawing is worth nothing. Maybe I am foolish to even try," he thought. He felt nervous and small. How could he, a poor boy with no teacher and no money, believe that real artists would even look at his work? But as he walked past the cathedral, he felt courage return. He imagined Rubens standing tall, looking at him through the mist. It was as if the great artist was saying, "Do not be afraid. I did not become great by being weak or scared." Nello ran home through the cold night, feeling comforted. He had done his best. The rest was in God's hands. The winter was very cold. That night, after they returned home, it began to snow. The snow kept falling for many days, covering the roads and fields. Even the small rivers froze. The cold was bitter on the open plains. It was hard work delivering milk in the dark, but even harder for Patrasche. Nello was young and strong, but Patrasche was getting old. His legs hurt and his body ached, but he never stopped working. Nello tried to make him rest. "Stay home, Patrasche. You deserve to rest. I can push the cart alone," he said many mornings, but Patrasche always refused. He was proud of his work, and he would not stop. He had lived his life in harness, and he would not stay behind now. He suffered in the cold, but he only took deep breaths, lowered his head, and kept walking. One must not stop until the end, Patrasche thought, and he knew that his own end was coming soon. His eyes were weaker, and getting up in the morning was painful, but still, every day when the chapel bell rang at 5, He got up and put himself in his harness. "My poor Patrasche," old Jahandas said one evening, stroking the dog's head with his weak hand. "Soon we will both rest forever." And both the old man and the old dog felt the same sadness. When they were gone, who would care for their beloved Nello? One afternoon, as they walked home from Antwerp through the snowy fields, they found a small toy in the road. It was a little puppet, a tambourine player, dressed in red and gold. It was 6 inches tall, but not broken at all. Nello looked for the owner, but no one claimed it. He thought it would make a nice gift for Alois. That night, as he passed the mill, he saw the small window of her room. They had been friends for so long. Surely it would not be wrong to give her this toy. A shed stood beneath her window. He climbed onto the roof and tapped softly. A little light shone inside. Alois opened the window, looking surprised and a little afraid. Nello held out the puppet. "I found this in the snow, Alois. Take it. May God bless you, dear," he whispered. Before she could answer, he climbed down and ran off into the night. That night there was a fire at the mill. Some buildings burned, and much grain was lost. But the mill and the house were safe. The whole village rushed to help, and fire engines came from Antwerp. Bascoges was insured and would not lose money. But he was very angry. He told everyone that the fire had not been an accident. It had been set on purpose. When Nello heard about the fire, he ran to help, but Bascoges pushed him away. "You were near my house last night," he shouted. "I believe you know something about this fire." Nello was shocked. He did not understand how someone could say such a thing. But Bascoges told many people in the village that Nello had been near the mill after dark. Some people started to believe it. They whispered that maybe he had started the fire because he was angry about Alois. No one truly believed he was guilty. But the people were poor, and they wanted to stay on Bascoges's good side. So they followed his lead. The next morning, Nello and Patrasche went to collect the milk, as always. But something had changed. At every house, the warm smiles were gone. People did not greet them. They gave them the milk quickly, with cold eyes and few words. No one accused him, but no one welcomed him anymore. Even Bascoges's wife cried, "You are cruel to the boy. He is good and kind. He would never do such a terrible thing." But Bascoges did not change his mind. Once he had said something, he would not take it back. Nello did not argue. He accepted it with quiet dignity. But when he was alone with Patrasche, he let his sadness show. "If I win," he thought, "maybe they will believe in me again. Maybe they will be sorry." But it was hard. For a boy who had always been loved in his village, it was painful to have everyone turn away. It was especially hard in the cold winter. The village was a warm and happy place at Christmas. Every house had cakes, soups, and laughter. The bells rang cheerfully, and people gathered together for church and feasts. But for Nello and Patrasche, the world had turned cold, and in their little hut, there was no warmth, no light, and sometimes not even bread to eat. A man from Antwerp had started buying milk from the farmers with his mule. Many people sold to him instead of Nello. Now only a few farmers still gave their milk to the little green cart. Patrasche stopped at each house, looking up with his kind, hopeful eyes. But the doors remained closed. The people felt guilty. They did not truly believe Nello had done anything wrong, but they wanted to please Bascoges. Christmas was near. The weather was terrible. The snow was 6 feet deep, and the ice was thick. The village was full of music and joy. The houses were warm, and every family had food and gifts. But in the little hut by the fields, it was dark, cold, and lonely. Nello and Patrasche were left all alone. One night, just before Christmas, death came to their home and took away old Jahandas forever. He had been weak and sick for a long time, unable to move except for small gestures. He could only speak soft words, but he had always loved them. When Nello and Patrasche woke up in the cold morning and found him gone, their hearts were broken. Even though he had been just a poor old man, his love had been their warmth and comfort. Now he was gone. They followed his simple wooden coffin to a nameless grave near the small gray church. They were the only mourners, just a young boy and an old dog. The miller's wife looked at her husband, hoping he would finally show kindness and let Nello come inside. But Bas Koges only hardened his heart. He would not open his door. The boy is just a beggar, he thought. He must stay away from Alois. His wife said nothing, but later she gave Alois a small wreath of flowers. She told her daughter to take it to the grave and lay it gently on the fresh snow. Nello and Patrasche returned home, filled with sadness, but even their small, poor home was taken from them. The rent was due, and Nello had no money left after paying for his grandfather's funeral. He went to the owner of the hut, a cobbler who often drank wine with Bas Koges. The cobbler had no pity. He loved money more than kindness. He took everything in the hut as payment and told Nello and Patrasche to leave the next morning. The little home had been poor and small, but it was full of memories. It had been a happy place. In summer, the vine climbed its walls, and the fields around it were bright with flowers. Even though life there had been hard, it had been filled with love. Now, Nello and Patrasche had nowhere to go. That night, they sat in the cold, empty hut, huddled together for warmth. The fire was gone, the room was dark, and their hearts felt frozen. Morning came, and it was Christmas Eve. Nello held Patrasche close, his tears falling on the dog's fur. "Let's go, Patrasche. We will not wait to be thrown out. Let's leave now." Patrasche had no will but his master's. So, side by side, they left the only home they had ever known. As they walked past the green cart, Patrasche lowered his head sadly. It was no longer his. The cart had been taken to pay the rent, and his brass harness lay unused in the snow. Patrasche wanted to lie down and give up. But Nello was still alive, and as long as the boy needed him, he would not stop. They walked toward Antwerp. It was early morning, and the village was quiet. Some people were outside, but no one spoke to them. Nello stopped at a door. His grandfather had often helped the people inside. "Would you give Patrasche a crust of bread?" he asked softly. "He is old and he hasn't eaten since yesterday." The woman inside quickly shut the door. "Grain is expensive this year," she muttered. Nello and Patrasche moved on, asking no one else. They reached Antwerp as the church bells struck 10. "If only I had something to sell, I could buy food for Patrasche," Nello thought. But he had nothing, just the thin clothes on his back and his wooden shoes. Patrasche understood his worry. He nuzzled Nello's hand as if to say, "Do not be sad. I will be fine." At noon, the winner of the drawing contest would be announced. Nello made his way to the big public building where he had left his picture. A crowd of boys stood there, some his age, some older. They all had family or friends with them. Nello stood alone, holding Patrasche close. The great bells rang loudly as the doors opened. Everyone rushed inside. Nello's heart beat fast. His head felt light, his vision blurred. Then he saw the chosen picture raised above all the others. It was not his. A man's voice announced the winner. "Stephen Keislinger, son of a wharf worker in Antwerp, has won the prize." Nello did not remember what happened next. When he woke up, he was lying outside on the cold stone ground. Patrasche licked his face, trying to wake him. In the distance, a group of boys cheered and carried Stephen Keislinger home in celebration. Nello pulled himself up and hugged Patrasche. "It is over," he whispered. "All over." Weak from hunger, he started walking back to the village. Patrasche walked beside him, tired and cold. Snow was falling heavily. A strong wind blew across the plains. It was bitter and cruel. The walk home was long. It was already 4 o'clock when they reached the village. Suddenly, Patrasche stopped. His nose caught a scent in the snow. He scratched, whined, and pulled out a small leather case with his teeth. He held it up to Nello. They were standing by a small wooden cross where a dim lamp flickered. Nello turned the case toward the light. It had a name on it, Bas Coges. Inside were banknotes, 2,000 francs. For the first time that day, Nello felt something other than sadness. He put the case inside his shirt, patted Patrasche, and walked straight to the mill. He knocked on the door. Bas Coges's wife answered, her eyes red from crying. Alois clung to her skirts. "Is that you, Nello?" she asked gently. "Go away before my husband sees you. We are in great trouble tonight. He lost a lot of money on his way home. In this snow, he will never find it. And without it, we may be ruined. It is God's punishment for what we did to you." Nello handed her the leather case. "Patrasche found this tonight," he said. "Tell Bas Coges, I think now he will give Patrasche food and shelter. Please take care of him." Before she or the dog understood what he meant, Nello bent down and kissed Patrasche on the head. Then he turned and ran into the night. The woman and child stood in shock, unable to speak. Patrasche howled and scratched at the door, desperate to follow Nello. They tried to calm him. They brought him warm food and soft blankets, but he would not eat or rest. Patrasche did not care about comfort. He wanted his boy. At 6 o'clock, Bas Coges returned, cold and exhausted. "It is lost forever," he said, his face pale. "We searched everywhere, but the money is gone. Alois's future is ruined." His wife placed the leather case in his hands. Bas Coges stared at it in shock. He trembled as she told him what had happened. For the first time, his strong, proud body sank into a chair. He covered his face with his hands. "I have been cruel to that boy," he whispered. "I do not deserve his kindness." Little Alois, feeling brave, went close to her father and leaned her fair, curly head against him. "Nello can come back now, father?" she asked softly. "He can come tomorrow, like before?" The miller hugged his daughter. His rough face looked pale, and his mouth trembled. "Yes, yes," he said. "He can stay here on Christmas Day, and any other day too. With God's help, I will make things right. I will make it up to him." Alois kissed him, happy and thankful. Then she ran to where Patrasche waited at the door. "And tonight may I give Patrasche a feast?" she asked excitedly. Her father nodded seriously. "Yes, yes, give the dog the best food," he said. His heart was heavy, and he felt deep regret for what he had done. It was Christmas Eve. The mill house was warm and bright. Logs burned in the fireplace, and there was plenty of food, cream, honey, meat, and bread. The house smelled of cooking, and the walls were decorated with green wreaths. The old cuckoo clock and the wooden cross on the wall were covered in holly. There were small lanterns for Alois, pretty toys, and sweet treats wrapped in shiny paper. There was happiness everywhere. Alois wanted Patrasche to stay and enjoy the warmth and food with them. But Patrasche did not care about warmth or food. He was cold and hungry, but without Nello, he refused to eat or rest. He stayed by the door, waiting for a chance to escape. "He wants the boy," Bas Coges said, watching. "Good dog, good faithful dog. I will go find Nello at sunrise." No one knew that Nello had left his home. Only Patrasche understood that the boy had gone into the night alone, with nowhere to go. Inside, the house was full of joy. Neighbors came to drink wine and eat roasted goose. Alois laughed and played, excited for Christmas morning. Bas Coges, feeling guilty, talked about how he would help Nello from now on. His wife sat calmly at her spinning wheel. The cuckoo clock chimed cheerfully. Everyone was happy, except for Patrasche. The dog refused to stay. He was waiting for the door to open. At last, when someone carelessly left it unlocked, Patrasche slipped outside and ran as fast as his tired legs could carry him. It was a black, freezing night. Snow had been falling for hours, covering all the roads and fields. Patrasche had only one thought. He had to find Nello. A human friend might have stayed by the fire and enjoyed the warmth. But Patrasche was not like that. He remembered the day when an old man and a little child had found him dying in a ditch and saved his life. The boy's footsteps were almost hidden under the fresh snow. It took Patrasche a long time to find any trace of him. The night was wild. The lamps on the roads had blown out. The ground was covered in thick ice. The wind howled through the streets, shaking the wooden signs above the doors. There were no people outside. Everyone was safe inside their homes. Only Patrasche was out in the cold, hungry and in pain, but determined to find the boy he loved. The faint trail led him toward Antwerp. It was past midnight when he reached the city. The streets were dark. The only lights came from small cracks in shuttered windows, where people celebrated inside. Drunken men sang as they stumbled home with lanterns. The dog's paws were cut by the ice, and the cold burned his body. But he did not stop. He had to find Nello. At last, Patrasche found the boy's footprints leading up the stone steps of the great cathedral. He has gone to the place he loves, the dog thought. Patrasche could not understand Nello's love for art, but he respected it. The church doors had been left unlocked by accident. Snowy footprints led inside. Patrasche followed the trail through the dark, silent church. It was cold and empty. Under the tall arches, Patrasche found Nello. The boy was lying still on the stone floor. The dog crept close and gently touched his face with his nose. "Did you think I would leave you?" Patrasche seemed to say. "I am a dog. I will never leave you." Nello woke up weakly and hugged him tightly. "Let's lie here together and die," he whispered. "The world does not need us." Patrasche lay beside him, resting his head on Nello's chest. His brown eyes were full of tears, but not for himself. He was happy. The wind blew through the cathedral, colder than outside. The huge stone walls trapped the freezing air inside. A bat fluttered in the darkness. Shadows moved over the statues. Nello and Patrasche lay still together. They dreamed of summer days, running through flower-filled fields, hiding in the tall reeds by the river, watching boats sail away under the golden sun. Then, suddenly, the moon broke through the clouds. A bright silver light filled the cathedral. For the first time, the paintings of Rubens above them were fully visible. The elevation and the descent of the cross shone in the moonlight. Nello opened his eyes and saw them. Tears of joy rolled down his pale face. "I have seen them at last," he cried. "Oh God, that is enough." His legs gave way, and he fell to his knees. His eyes never left the beautiful paintings. For a few moments, the light shone on them, bright as if it came from heaven itself. Then, suddenly, the clouds returned. Darkness fell again, and Christ's face was hidden. Nello's arms wrapped around Patrasche. "We will see his face in heaven," he whispered, "and there he will not separate us." On Christmas morning, the people of Antwerp found them. The boy and the dog lay together by the altar. They were both dead. The cold had taken them both in the night. When the priests arrived, the church was still. The veils over the paintings had been drawn back, and sunlight touched the image of Christ. As the city woke up, a strong man with a hard face entered the cathedral. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "I was cruel to the boy," Boscoges whispered. "Now I would have given him half of all I own. I would have treated him as my own son. Later that morning, a famous painter arrived. "I was looking for a boy," he said. "A boy who should have won the prize yesterday. His drawing was simple, an old man sitting on a fallen tree, but there was greatness in it. I wanted to find him and teach him art." And a little girl, sobbing, ran into the church. "Oh, Nello," Alois cried. "Come home. We have Christmas gifts for you. Mother says you can stay with us always, and Patrasche will be so happy. Please, wake up, Nello." But the boy, lying with a peaceful smile, did not answer. The Christmas bells rang through the snowy streets. The people of Antwerp celebrated with joy. But Nello and Patrasche did not ask for anything anymore. At last, Antwerp gave them what they needed, without being asked. Death had been kinder to them than life. It had taken them in love and innocence, away from a world that had no place for them. They had always been together, and in death, they were not divided. When they were found, Nello's arms were wrapped so tightly around Patrasche that they could not be separated. Ashamed and sorrowful, the village begged for a special place for them to rest. And so, Nello and Patrasche were buried together, side by side, forever.